Right, let's discuss this story further with brand maverick, Thebe Ikalafeng. Thebe, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on. When you saw the story and there was this outrage, you tweeted, "It's a travesty. It's unacceptable to be selling a legacy of even African history." You said this should be stopped at all costs. Two minds to that, to say, well, we didn't even know these relics existed until this particular case came to the fore. So as far as they are concerned, they would have remained the property of the family. And so maybe it's outside of our jurisdiction to want to claim them now.
But I think we should have known. Because if we had a much clearer and a much more robust heritage policy or policy around the heritage of the legacies of institutions such as Mandela and many other people who are integral to the history of South Africa, we would have known all this. All these, by the way, should have been dealt with already before 2013 when he passed on. So I think on that part, of course, I mean, there's two sides to this as well. The one side is it's his family, it's his child, and she's got a right to all do this. But on the one side is to actually look at the way Zizi looked at it, that Mandela is actually integral to the South African history. He is South Africa. So South Africa has got a claim on all his assets. We should have known.
So if we should have known what went wrong, let's look at our heritage protection policies. What is wrong, and why were these relics unprotected?
What went wrong is what goes wrong with a lot of the history of South Africa. The fact that we can have a Lily's farm go on being threatened to be closed. The fact that Mandela's house in Soweto can be threatened to be closed. The fact that Winnie Mandela's house is in dispute right now. The fact that Winnie Mandela's house in Brown and all those. So it's a broader challenge for South Africa on how to deal with South Africa's history. It's a bigger history, it's a bigger challenge. The fact that even our history is not taught in schools. So how are you going to protect something that you actually do not know?
Yeah, you wrote a little bit earlier in 2012, for example, around the protection of something like the 664 brand, which of course then became T-shirts, became hats, became caps, became a whole lot of things. But we didn't own that either, did we?
Well, I mean, in 2012, when I wrote about this article, I mean, the sum of my opinion then was that we have taken Mandela as brand into a high street commodity rather than the cornerstone of our history and our heritage. So the challenge for the country is how to reclaim and how to maintain and how to curate our history for perpetuity. We don't want to be in situations where many years down the road we go and look for Gerard Sekwa's work to come and repatriate. We go look for Sarki Bartman to come and repatriate into South Africa. What we want to do, we want to be proactive before these people pass on, before this history becomes extinct. And how do we protect it? And of course, around 2012 and all those, there was a proliferation of everybody wanting to take advantage of Mandela. And then he was in his twilight years, if you recall, as you said, right, coming up with the ridiculous 44446 T-shirts and people claiming that it is the globalization of Mandela. Mandela was already a global brand. I mean, you're looking at, for example, that time his lawyer Ismail Ayob was accused of selling counterfeits of Mandela's artwork. So everybody's has taken advantage of Mandela, both in the family and outside of the family. And unfortunately, even many of the institutions that the Mandela itself has, that Mandela and anybody related to has established, whether it's the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, the Mandela Rose Foundation, there's not even an integration among those or a relationship which ensures that there is a cohesive and coordinated approach on how to protect and to manage and to curate the history of Mandela.
So I'd say, why then would you look at the auction as a devaluation? I mean, what does owning a Mandela shirt, owning a Mandela ID, briefcase, what does it represent far beyond just, I suppose, an artifact?
It represents a repatriation of our history, which we have fought for many years to bring back to South Africa. It represents the commoditization of our history by putting on auction a Mandela's key, for example. The key should not even be, the key of Robben Island should not even be on sale, because in theory, it is not even a property of Nelson Mandela. It's a property of Robben Island. It's a property of the state of South Africa, in theory. In theory, the ID, just like the passport, while it is used to identify who you are, in theory, it is the property of the state. So a whole lot of these, and those are just the ones which are perhaps easier to explain. But when it comes to others like the shirts, I mean, this past weekend, I was in Ghana this past weekend, and I went to W.E.B. Du Bois museum, and I was quite astounded to see in that museum they had his gown when he graduated from Harvard as the first black man to get a PhD from Harvard. They got his gown when he graduated. I think it was from Russia. I can't remember where the second one, but they had his books on South Africa, on Africa, on Pan-Africanism. And I said, that's what we need to do. I guess that's what a Thabo Mbeki is trying to do, for example, with the Thabo Mbeki library. And that's what the Nelson Mandela Foundation has tried to do as well. But of course, until our good friend Jerry Mabena and the Nelson Mandela Foundation rescued the one house where Mandela used to stay for the first couple of years when he started his presidency, it would have been as dilapidated and been abused. So it calls to me for a private-public partnership on how to curate and to save some of this of South Africa's history.
Talk about that private-public partnership operating under increasingly tight economic conditions. The other argument is, I mean, it's an argument, it's out there. It's understandable why a family member would want to explore ways of getting cash out of these items.
And that's why, I said in the beginning, I said, on the one hand, I understand if it's Mandela is my father, the question I guess I'll have myself is, how much value can I extract if he didn't leave me enough? If I'm not a trust fund baby, how much value can I extract? But I think there needs to be a sensibility as well. A sensibility, even whether it's a family member, to understand the historical location of Mandela in the broader story of South Africa, the broader identity of South Africa, rather than to look at these items as the items which are valuable belonging to somebody famous. So Mandela is not, to me, just somebody famous. He is the embodiment of the South African struggle, the embodiment of South African freedom, and if it's the embodiment of all those, then that collective represents something that should be curated and protected at all costs. And whether you're a family member or not family member, we should find ways to protect that. If the government has, for example, the will, as they did a few years ago, to spend R1 billion to go and pay for somebody's wine farm, and which in one of the land restitution programs, surely in this instance, the government should have the wherewithal from a heritage perspective to ask ourselves the question, should we not have, quote unquote, a budget to buy off of the family such items? Yeah. In this instance, if the issue is if they cannot donate them, certainly can we then pay for them a nominal fee so that they at least transfer to a much safer place, so that not my children, the children of the children, and everybody else afterwards gets to understand where we come from. Right now, everybody else believes and thinks, anybody born in 2000 on, thinks that apartheid is a figment of the old people's imagination. So what we don't want the next generation to even ask the question, who is this Mandela? Wasn't he just some old guy who committed some crime and was stuck in jail? We want them to understand why he was there, what he represents, what he contributed to South Africa. Of course, somebody will say, oh, but Mandela was not perfect. But then who is perfect? So may the first one who's perfect please throw a stone.
So the context of your 2012 article, as you put it, was completely different. You were still alive then, and there were concerts and there were things that were being done. But you asked a question, or at least you made a statement. You said no one has yet put value on Brand Mandela. Although he retired from public life 2004, the image is powerful and valuable. In context of the conversation we are having now, if we are to approach the family, what value do you put on it? What amount do you give them that would make sense?
Interesting. So So around 2012, actually even now, it was done most recently by my good friends at Brand Finance in London. And when they put a valuation on just what the Queen or the royal family contributes to Brand UK, and it was like a 50 billion pound a number of that nature. And that was just the royal family, because the royal family, in similar way, in Mandela, like the royal family, in similar way, represents the embodiment of the English culture, the English heritage. So to South Africa, Mandela is the embodiment of South Africa, of Africa, and that's why every now and then a coming president, passing president will say we need to return to the values of a Mandela. So I don't know if the Queen is worth 50 billion pounds. I have no clue what Mandela would be. Let's put a $50 billion on Mandela's name. And then anybody who wants to buy anything from Mandela, let's charge them $50 billion. Let's see how interesting that conversation will go.
Let's talk then about the intangibles. You say, of course, the brand, besides the high street commodity that it had become at the time, was rather a different thing. It should be a cornerstone of our democracy. It should be a cornerstone of I suppose, life in South Africa itself, which then goes to the next part of protecting our heritage. How do we manage this now going forward?
Mr. Latper, how do we
manage it? How do we manage? Because, for example, the organization must protect, must monitor, and must manage this heritage.
Yes. So, right now the fight is between the SA Heritage Resources Agency and the Mandela family. So the SA Heritage Resources ostensibly representing South Africa at the government. But I think it's going to be a win-win, a give or take situation. I think the family needs to be brought into place because rightfully it is their blood. But I think the government needs to be brought into the SA Heritage. But I think then the other institutions which Mandela had signed up, the NMF, Mandela Foundation, the Children's Fund, the Mandela Rose, and all those institutions which collectively they should come together and create a quote-unquote a trust that looks after the intellectual property called Mandela, because at the end of the day, he is a brand, the same way that South Africa is a brand, and he is a brand that embodies the brand of South Africa. So I think there needs to be perhaps a trust or some organization that sits above the family, sits above the institutions created, sits above government, and its responsibility is to manage into perpetuity not just the intellectual property, but also the quote-unquote exploitation of this intellectual property. Because it is ridiculous to have a place called Mandela Square, where people go and shop anything that we can think of under the sun. It is ridiculous that whenever you hear or see the name Mandela, people want to plaster it onto a mug, onto a T-shirt, or rather onto anything that's made in China, doesn't even represent who we are as a country. So I think we need a representative organization that sits above all these to represent the intellectual property as well as the exploitation of that property and management of how we manage that history. Because more than just an intellectual property, he is the history of South Africa.
So, in South Africa, whenever we're talking about forming another organization or forming another entity, a question is always asked, is the state even capable of doing good things with the legacy of Mandela?
Well, as you see now, I mentioned three entities, right? I mentioned family, and I mentioned the existing non-profit organizations, and then I mentioned the state entity called South Africa Heritage Resources Agency. So if the three of them come together, they are not necessarily a government institution, but represents multiple interests. And perhaps this is where we then need to be asking even corporate South Africa. If corporate South Africa can help to establish and fund a National Mandela Foundation, which is probably if anything else, is probably the finest repository of Mandela's heritage. If the private sector can help to establish that, surely they can also lend their experience and expertise. I'm probably not, there's lots of people like myself who understand intellectual property, branding, and exploitation thereof.
Thebe Ikalafeng.
And there's millions in South Africa. We have some of the finest IP firms in the continent, perhaps in the world, some of the finest branding representatives in the country, and some of the best corporates. So we have the resources in the country. It's a matter of just ensuring when we do establish such an entity, that that entity should be above petty politics and above petty family politics.
Thebe Ikalafeng, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on this evening. That's Brand Maverick, Thebe Ikalafeng.